New Mexico Territory, April 1883. The desert wind tore at Grace Sutton's bonnet as the stagecoach jolted to a stop outside the town of Dry Creek, its wheels kicking up red dust into the rising sun. She stepped down with trembling hands, clutching her carpetbag, eyes scanning the empty street. It was not the welcome she had imagined when she answered the newspaper ad for a husband. He was supposed to be waiting. Instead, a man in a long brown coat stood leaning against the post of the telegraph office, arms crossed. His name was Wesley Hargrove, and he was not smiling. He was the man who had paid for her passage, and now that she was here, the look in his eyes made her stomach twist. "You took your time," he said, stepping forward. His voice was rough, impatient. "Get your things. We leave now." "I thought we would stay in town for a few days," she said, her voice too soft. Wesley grabbed the bag from her hand. "You thought wrong." The ride to his homestead was silent but for the jostle of the wagon and the creak of leather. Grace sat stiffly, hands folded, watching the scrubland roll past. When they reached the house, a squat, lonely building with a broken fence and a roof patched in tar, she felt her hopes sink. Wesley's cruelty revealed itself fast. He did not speak to her unless barking orders. Meals were cold, words colder. On the third night, he knocked over a lamp in anger and lashed out when she tried to clean the mess. That was when she knew she had to leave. Grace waited until the moon was high. She packed only what she could carry: some bread, a flask of water, and the locket her mother gave her before she died. She slipped out barefoot, walking fast into the desert night. By dawn, her feet were bleeding. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to move. She followed the sun, hoping to find a road, a town, anything. By midday, her lips were cracked and the ground shimmered with heat. She stumbled once, twice, then fell. When she opened her eyes, a man was crouching beside her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, steady. She blinked up into a sun-browned face, green eyes shaded under the brim of a dusty hat. He offered her water. She took it with shaking hands. "I ran," she whispered, "from a man." He nodded. "Looks like you did." He helped her sit up. "Name's Nolan Langford. I've got a place near here. You can rest there a while. No one will bother you." She looked at him, trying to read his face. There was no threat there, just quiet concern. "I'm Grace," she said. "Come on, Grace," he said, standing. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Nolan's cabin was a few miles north, nestled between cottonwoods near a narrow creek. It was small, just 2 rooms, but clean and warm. He gave her his bed and made cornbread while she washed up at the basin. He did not ask questions. For 2 days, she barely spoke. He did not press her. On the third morning, she sat by the stove, hands wrapped around a tin cup. "He lied about everything," she said. "Said he had a ranch. Said he was kind. I thought maybe I'd have a place." Nolan stirred the pot on the stove. "You still can." She looked up at him. "I don't have anyone." "You do now," he said simply. That afternoon, he took her to town on his wagon. Folks stared, but no one asked. Grace bought a new dress with the little money she had left. Nolan stood outside the mercantile, waiting. When she came out, he gave her a quiet smile that warmed her chest. They settled into a rhythm. She helped him with chores, mending shirts, baking bread, brushing down the horses. He showed her how to patch fence rails and gather eggs without spooking the hens. He never touched her without asking. And every night, she fell asleep to the sound of his boots pacing quietly outside her door. One morning, as she washed clothes by the creek, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Nolan sat on a rock nearby, whittling a piece of cedar. "Saw a woman in trouble." "That's reason enough. But most folks wouldn't. I am not most folks." She smiled, just a little. Weeks passed. The desert bloomed with spring rain, and Grace felt something in her chest soften. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the buttes, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not move away. "I feel like I can breathe here," she said. He laid his hand over hers. "That is all I want." She turned to him. "You have been so good to me." You deserve that. And more. She looked at him, heart pounding. Slowly, she reached up and touched his cheek. I think I am falling in love with you, Nolan. His eyes searched hers. I already did, Grace. She kissed him, then soft and slow. His arms went around her, strong and sure. That night, she did not sleep in the guest room. Nolan lit a lantern and pulled her close. You do not have to be afraid anymore, he said. I am not, she whispered. They married a week later under the cottonwoods. Just the two of them and the preacher from town. She wore a blue dress. He wore his best shirt. When he kissed her after the vows, she felt the past fall away. Grace Sutton had come west to marry a stranger. She had escaped cruelty, walked through dust and heat, and found something she never expected. Love. Real love. And it was hers now. Forever. By early May, the cottonwood leaves had turned silver green in the breeze, and the creek ran higher with meltwater from the distant mountains. Grace hung linens on the line behind the cabin, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms freckled and damp from the wash bucket. Nolan was mending a broken gatepost near the corral, his shirt off in the heat, back taut with effort. They worked in companionable quiet, the wind tugging gently at her skirts. Fence might not hold another season, he called over his shoulder. She stepped around the line, wiping her hands on her apron. Could we use that spare timber from the shed? He stood, brushing grit from his palms. Some of its sound might get us through summer, but I'll need to do a haul from the mill before fall. Then I'll ride with you, she said. Nolan looked at her a long second. You sure? I'm not staying behind while you rattle off into the hills alone. We're married now, aren't we? His mouth tugged into a slow grin. Yes, we are. At dinner, they sat across from each other, elbows brushing above the stew pot. Grace had added wild onions she found near the creek, and Nolan's eyebrows lifted at the first bite. Didn't expect it to taste like anything but salt, he said. Your expectations are too low, she said, pouring him more tea. Later that night, Nolan sat on the edge of the bed unlacing his boots while Grace brushed her hair beside the oil lamp. The golden light caught the curve of her neck, and he reached out, letting his fingers rest there. You ever think about what you want this place to become? He asked. She set down the brush. Sometimes, I think about a garden. Maybe a goat. A rocking chair on the porch that doesn't creak so loud. His hand dropped to hers, callous fingers warm. I think about a child. She turned to him, still and quiet. Is that something you want? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Grace looked down, then back at him. I'd like that. If it happens. In the morning, a parcel arrived from Nolan's sister in Santa Fe, a bolt of calico, and a letter written in careful cursive. He handed it to Grace without opening it. She writes better than I do, he muttered. Grace laughed under her breath and unfolded the letter at the kitchen table. She says she heard about our wedding through a neighbor. Wants us to visit before the year is out. Nolan leaned against the doorframe. Would that suit you? I've never been to Santa Fe. Might be nice to see what colors women wear there. She looked up. Do you miss her? He considered that. Sometimes. She's the only blood I've got left. But this place is home now. You're here. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The clouds came low and fast, and Nolan brought in the horses while Grace shuttered the windows. Rain struck hard against the roof, and thunder cracked over the hills. They sat close by the hearth, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arms circling her waist. It's strange, she said after a long silence. How fast a place can start to feel like it belongs to you. He rested his cheek against her hair. Maybe it always did. The next morning, the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Grace stepped outside with a basket and gathered the storm-felled apples from the tree near the fence. As she bent to reach one half buried in mud, she felt Nolan's presence behind her before she heard him. He crouched without a word and helped her gather the last few. When their hands brushed, neither pulled away. I had a dream last night, she said, voice soft. I was still running, but this time you were waiting at the end. He reached out and tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. Then it wasn't a dream. She held his gaze. No, it wasn't. They carried the apples inside and Nolan set them gently in the basin. Pie or jam? He asked. Pie, she said. Always pie. As she rolled out the dough, he watched her with a kind of quiet reverence. She moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, like she had always been there. And in his heart, he knew she had. They ate the pie warm, forks clinking against tin plates, steam curling in the lamplight. Nolan reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. We can build anything here, he said. She nodded. We already are. By late June, the heat pressed down like a heavy quilt, thickening the air and slowing every task. Nolan rose before the light had fully crested the hills, tending to the stock while the shadows still clung to the edges of the barn. Grace, barefoot in the kitchen, preserved beans with her sleeves rolled and her braid tucked under a cotton kerchief. The rhythm of their days had settled into something solid, a shared pace that neither disturbed. Nolan returned from the field one afternoon with a bloodied hand and a tight jaw. Barbed wire snapped, he said, holding the limb out while Grace fetched the basin and lye soap. You wrap it in a rag? She asked, lowering his hand into the water. Didn't have time. Cow'd already gone lame, had to pull her clear of a ditch. Grace patted his skin gently with a cloth and reached for the jar of goose fat. You'll scar. Better me than her. She worked in silence, wrapping the wound with muslin, her fingers steady. When she finished, she rested his hand in his lap and looked up. You ever think about hiring someone on? Just for the bigger jobs. Nolan flexed his fingers slightly. Thought about it. Trouble is, folks don't stay. They want wages I can't pay or they're gone come winter. I could take on more. You already do more than I ask. Then ask more, she said, standing. He watched her cross the room, something unreadable in his eyes. That evening, she found him sitting near the old stone well, sleeves rolled to the elbow, cigarette burning low between his fingers. She sat down on the overturned barrel beside him, hands folded in her lap. You ever miss the trail? She asked. He flicked ash into the dirt. Sometimes. There's a quiet out there you can't find anywhere else. But I never had a reason to stay in one spot before. She turned toward him. And now? He looked at her then, the kind of look that made everything around them fall away. Now I tear the wheels off any wagon that tried to carry me off. Her breath caught, not from surprise but from the quiet certainty in his voice. I used to think I was running toward something, she said. But I was only running away. Until you. The next morning, before the sun had warmed the porch boards, a rider came down the road. Nolan stepped out with his rifle across his arm, but the man held up both hands. Name's Jasper Cole. Sheriff out of Las Cruces, he said, dismounting. Looking for a woman named Grace Sutton. Nolan's stance shifted subtly, but he didn't lower the weapon. Grace stepped forward, her face calm. I'm her. The sheriff removed his hat. Got word a man named Wesley Hargrove filed a charge for theft. Claims you took money that wasn't yours. I took nothing but what I came with, Grace said. And I left because he struck me. The sheriff's eyes settled on Nolan. You her kin. Husband, Nolan said. Well, ma'am, the sheriff said, nodding slowly, I'm not here to drag you back. Just needed to hear your side for the record. We'll mark it settled. Grace nodded once. Thank you. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode out without another word. Nolan stayed silent until the dust settled. You all right? He asked. I am, she said, her voice firm. That night, she sat beside him on the porch, knees brushing. Fireflies drifted near the edge of the cottonwoods, and the crickets had taken up their evening chorus. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she said. You are, Nolan answered. Always. She leaned into him, her cheek resting against his shoulder. I want to build something with you, she said. Not just a life. A place where we raise children who never have to run from anything. He turned and kissed her hair, slow and steady. Then we will. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the faint scent of apple peel and smoke. The bed waited, rumpled and warm. When he took her hand, she followed without hesitation. And from then on, no shadow from her past ever crossed their threshold again. By mid-July, the days burned long and slow, and the high desert rang with cicadas and the distant calls of nighthawks. Grace rose earlier now, her body adjusting to the pace of the land, her tasks woven into the rhythm of Nolan's. The soil behind the cabin had begun to soften, and she worked it with a hoe in her hands, coaxing rows of squash and beans to rise in the hard ground. One morning, Nolan returned from the South Ridge with a leaden look in his eyes. He unsaddled his horse with methodical care, then rested his forearms on the stall door, shoulders tense. Grace stepped into the barn, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What did you see?" He didn't lift his head. "Carrying birds near the arroyo bend. Went to look, found a wagon turned over, half-burned. Belonged to the Kesslers." She drew in a breath, slow and quiet. "That's nearly 20 miles from here. Too close. Whoever did it left nothing standing. No supplies, no horses. Just ruin. Did you bury them?" He nodded once. "Couldn't leave them like that." She placed a hand on his back, not speaking. Later that afternoon, Nolan repaired the barn roof while Grace brought out cold water in a tin cup. He took it with a grateful glance but said nothing. She sat on the upturned bucket nearby, watching the sky shift toward a deeper blue. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse," she said after a moment. "It sits empty most seasons. Just needs a coat of paint and someone to sweep it out." He rested the hammer on his knee. "You mean to teach?" "I did for 3 years back in Missouri. Girls mostly reading, some's scripture. I never spoke of it before." He studied her face, the set of her mouth. "You miss it?" "Sometimes. It's a way to give something back. There'll be more children in these hills before long." He nodded. "I'll help fix the roof before the rains come." That night, they sat together beneath the stars, a blanket spread across the dry grass. The land stretched wide and dark around them, the air thick with sage. Grace leaned against his side, her hand resting over his. "I never felt needed before," she said. "Not like this." "You're more than needed, Grace." She turned her head toward him, her voice barely above the breeze. "I've stopped waking from dreams afraid I'll be back in that house." Nolan's jaw tightened. "No one will ever take you from here." She searched his face, then kissed him quietly without ceremony. They stayed like that, the moon climbing slow behind them. The next week, Nolan brought home a red-handled spade from a trading post up near Mesilla, and Grace used it to mark new beds for her garden. She planted root vegetables and bitter greens, laying stones to keep the rabbits out. Each morning, she checked her seedlings, whispering encouragement to them under her breath. One afternoon, while Nolan repaired a broken axle on the wagon, a traveler rode up the lane. He was an older man with a sunburned neck and a limp in one leg, leading a mule with a busted packstrap. "Name's Elbert," he said, tipping his hat to Grace. "Lost my way after a flash flood, took the trail north of Silver Bluff." Nolan offered him water and a place to rest his mule. They shared supper with him that evening: cornbread, pinto beans, and a pot of chicory coffee. Elbert spoke of distant places, the mining towns of Colorado, the thick pine woods of Arkansas, the yellow hills of Wyoming where the buffalo no longer roamed. After he turned in for the night on a pallet near the hearth, Grace whispered, "Do you miss all that? The road, the change?" Nolan shook his head, brushing his thumb along her wrist. "I've had enough of wandering. I'd rather know the scent of this place through every season than chase something that never roots." She smiled, slow and certain. In the morning, Elbert packed up and left with a nod of thanks, promising to send news if he passed through again. Nolan watched him disappear down the trail, then turned to Grace. "You ever want to see more of the world?" She considered it. "I want to build something here strong enough it could stand even if I left for a time. But no, I don't ache for distance like I used to." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and firm. "Then we'll build it. Together." By late summer, the garden had begun to yield. Grace carried in armfuls of squash and handfuls of beans, her hands stained with soil. Nolan fashioned a trellis from scrap wood, and she trained the vines upward, laughing when they clung to her fingers. One evening, as they shelled beans on the porch, Grace tilted her head toward the horizon. You ever think about giving this place a name? He looked out across the land, the hills now gold with dry grass. Only if you name it. She thought for a long moment. How about Haven? He nodded, a smile deepening the lines near his eyes. That fits. They finished the beans in silence, the last of the sun dipping below the ridge. In the hush that followed, Grace leaned into the curve of Nolan's shoulder, and he kissed the crown of her head. And in the quiet, Haven was born. The first frost came early that year, dusting the porch rails, and the garden rose in a brittle white that cracked beneath Grace's boots as she went to gather what was left of the greens. She pulled her shawl tighter, watching her breath curl in the morning air. The rose she'd planted now lay dormant, but in the stillness she felt no loss, only the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Inside, Nolan was setting kindling in the stove. He moved slower these days, not from age, but from the kind of care that came when a man had something to stay alive for. He looked up when she stepped in, shaking snow from her sleeves. "Ground'll be too hard by next week," he said. "If we're going to dig that root cellar, it has to be today." She set the basket down and nodded. "I'll bring the spade." They worked side by side behind the cabin, the soil breaking in dull clumps beneath the iron edge. Nolan dug while Grace cleared the loosened earth, their breath rising in clouds, the rhythm between them practiced and contained. A few birds traced the treeline, silent in the cold. "Thinking of putting shelves in once it's done," Nolan said, pausing to wipe his brow. "We can store flour, dried meat, maybe even some preserves come next year." She brushed dirt from her hands. "I could line them with muslin, keep the mice out." He straightened, resting his weight on the shovel. "You ever think you'd be doing this?" "I used to dream of a parlor," she said, smiling faintly. "Velvet curtains, porcelain teacups. But no, I never imagined this." "Or you." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with his knuckle. "I'm glad you did." "I didn't," she said, voice low. "But I'm glad I do now." They finished digging just before dusk. Nolan covered the pit with planks, and Grace laid stones around the edge to mark it. The wind picked up as they stepped inside, and the sky turned the color of faded denim. That night, Nolan brought out a tin box from the bottom shelf of the wardrobe. He set it on the table without a word. Grace watched as he lifted the lid and drew out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "What's that?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "My father's deed to this land. He filed it before I was born, never made it back to build anything. I found it locked in a drawer after he passed. Had to fight to keep it, but it was the only thing he left that meant anything." She ran her fingers along the faded ink. "And now it's yours." He looked at her, gaze steady. "Ours? I want to put your name on it." Her breath caught. "You sure? I've built more since you came than I ever did alone. This place is as much yours as mine." She folded the paper and gave it back to him. "Then write it. I'll sign." The next morning they rode into town. The notary looked over the document, made the additions in his careful hand, and handed over the pen. Grace signed slowly, her name curling beside Nolan's in dark ink. When they stepped back into the street, the wind had picked up and the church bell rang twice for the noon hour. "I was thinking," she said as they passed the mercantile, "about fixing up the schoolhouse after all." "You said you might," he replied. "I want to start in the spring. I'll need paint, nails, a new desk or two. And a bell, if we can find one." He glanced sideways at her. "You want me to build the desks? You build better than you write." He chuckled under his breath. "Fair enough." They stopped at the blacksmith's before heading home. Grace traded a bundle of dried herbs for a repaired hinge. The smith's wife, Miriam, handed over the wrapped parcel and leaned close. "Folks are saying you turned the cabin into something real," she said. "Not many women could have done what you've done." Grace didn't answer at first. She looked back at Nolan, who stood by the wagon, reins in hand, waiting. Then she nodded. "I didn't do it alone." They returned as the sun dipped, bathing Haven in gold. Nolan unloaded supplies while Grace unhitched the team. Inside, the fire waited and the smell of last week's apples still lingered in the corners. As they lay in bed that night, Nolan traced the curve of Grace's shoulder with slow fingers. "I think we ought to build a cradle next," he said. She turned to face him, her eyes soft in the lantern light. "Do you?" "I do." She pressed her palm to his chest over the steady beat of his heart. "Then we will." The first snow came 2 days later. It drifted gently, covering the fields and the fence posts, turning every sound to hush. Grace stood at the window watching it fall, her hands resting low on her belly. Behind her, Nolan wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Spring'll come fast," he murmured. "And we'll be ready," she said. Outside, the land slept beneath its white blanket, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed. In the cradle Nolan built with his own hands, their daughter would sleep by summer. The schoolhouse would open its doors. The shelves in the root cellar would fill. And every morning, Grace would rise knowing she had built a life from nothing but courage and love and the strength to begin again. Nolan kissed the side of her neck and pulled her close. They watched the snow fall, wrapped in each other, knowing they would never have to run again.